So I decided that as I'm reading something or writing something, whatever comes into my consciousness at the moment, exactly on the spot, I stop what I'm doing and start to write on that thing. I don't know what I'm going to write. No preparation, nothing. And then I finish a paragraph or two or whatever, and I go back. And then I continue reading, and it could happen the same day, it could happen the next day. And so for the last 3 weeks, that's what I've been doing. Well, let me tell you, the stuff that came out is unbelievable. I solved the ether problem, why the Michelson-Morley experiment was not conclusive. They said it was conclusive and it paved the way for Einstein, but they missed an option. I studied the ether for 2 years, a while ago, when I was teaching philosophy of science. I used to sit in the library and read all the stuff. I always had the impression that they threw out something with the baby with the bathwater. So we got relativity, but we lost something else. And I spent a couple of years on the problem. I came up empty-handed, dead end. Learned a lot, read a lot of, but as far as the problem was, came up a dead end. Okay, so, okay, Meshuggah. So, because I said that to one of the guys on Shabbat. He says, you may be taking yourself too seriously. It's my consciousness, remember. It's not somebody else who's reading it, and, like when somebody else reads something, you have an idea, and they have different angles than you have, and, okay. This is me. It's my consciousness. My stream of consciousness. He says, and I've always said intuition could be very, very right or very, very wrong. I mean, it's a form of intuition or something like that. Okay. To make the story short, Pavlov calls me up. He wrote an article, and he wants to know whether he should give it to some professors first or send it to the publisher. Okay. In the meantime, I told him. So, I would think he'd say, well, you're getting a little crazy. So what does he tell me? Charles Sanders Peirce used the method for 50 years.
Which method?
What I said. You're reading something,
okay.
You catch any consciousness, comes something in my head, I was doing something, it said Mobius strip. I just put down Mobius strip. And then I started to write. That's not, Yaakov ladder. Whatever comes into my head is in that stream of consciousness going to think. So I was shocked because he said further, he worked on his master's thesis on Charles Sanders Peirce. He's the greatest American philosopher we ever had. He left 80,000 pages in manuscript. He wrote in 1900 in that kufa, and he was one of these maverick geniuses, that covered everything. And he covered all the topics that are now, 75 years later, coming into, which is icons and language and Egyptology. He was a maverick person. He was with William James in the beginning, the psychologist, the philosopher. James took him in at Harvard, and then they broke up, and he went his own way. As a matter of fact, the story has it, he worked for Popular Science magazine. He was an editor for Popular to make a living. And they also said that he used to burn manuscripts to keep warm. It's a big Chil Hashem in American intellectual history. He's a father. Now there's a revival. Harvard put out, over here Harvard put out 6 volumes of his collected papers and stuff like that. But now he left 80,000 pages. So Indiana University now is putting out the stuff. So what did he say? He says he has the microfilm. He has all the thing on microfilm. Okay, he has the whole Persian focus. So he said, I gotta tell you something. That's what Peirce did all his life. Of course, I flipped out. Crazy. Who would do such a thing?
Hello?
You go on the street and tell them what you did. Nobody look at you like a nutcase. Like
So it's just waiting for you to
total
print it
nutcase. They'll
to print
look at
it
you
out.
like a total nutcase. Okay, so he tells me about that. Then he says that the publishers, when they're publishing and putting together his works, they thought he was crazy, so they don't publish what he wrote. They didn't publish these things because he labeled everything. 2:30 a.m. July 16th. He labeled everything. And here's Charles Sanders Peirce, greatest American philosopher, and used the same method. I thought he was going to call me crazy. He says, you're in good company. And I did it. I mean, it's 3 weeks, only 3 weeks. But I wrote about 10 pages on different, things. And one of them was let's put it this way. I wouldn't call it a solution to the ether problem. I would say, because when I read over a couple of paragraphs, it's not gibberish. In other words, if I wrote nonsense syllables, that's what came to my head, then after a while you say, look, you are crazy. Put you in a booby hatch. But when you read what's written, okay, off the cuff, no preparation, nothing. When you read what's written, any person who's interested in the problem, and it has come back, in physics, with string theory, there's a lot of stuff coming back to reorganize things. Of course, looking for the life system. But anyway, the basic point was it was Peirce who did it. And so the publishers thought he was crazy, and they didn't publish the handwriting, because you could see it, and he labels it. Pavlov has the things on microfilm, so he has the whole corpus, and he said they didn't publish everything. They thought it's crazy. It's the rantings of a crazy man. So I know for me it's not rantings, because there are sentences, there's structure, so anybody who was interested in the problem would benefit by reading it, because he would say, oh, here's a crazy view. I disagree 100%. The guy's crazy. I disagree. But he would now sharpen up his own ideas. He couldn't pass it. He can't pass it by. But to me, that's what I learned over the years. The goal in philosophy is that the reader must enter. He can throw the whole thing away, but he must enter. He can't bypass, from his own assumptions, he can't bypass what you wrote. And that to me is the achievement. That's all you can hope for. To get consensus and everything, that's already a big thing. Look how many people, I learned over here in the group, with a small group like this, on everything there are 2 or 3 different angles that I didn't think of. So you see right away, I mean, you can't come in and say you got the answer. I mean, it opens up, but the people would comment and say, well, that's interesting, but I don't agree. And then we would have a discussion, but at least they're not passing it up just by givens, by just taking it as a given. And so I did this, and it's unbelievable. I gotta tell you, it's unbelievable. It just got into symmetries and the difference between chaotic and random. What's the difference between random and chaos? What's the whole orientation in science of this chaos theory? What the hell is it all about? And all of this is coming, as you'll see tonight toward the end, all of this is coming from the attempt to understand Basar Echad in the text. And you'll see from the presentation how this will feed in, but not at the moment, not at the beginning. But the point is to show that it's been taken as a metaphor for 2,000 years. The translation is wrong for 2,000 years. Okay? And nobody caught what the thing is all about. And to say it's a metaphor, why would the text give you a metaphor for something that's in the next pasuk about not being alone, and you have to leave your parents and get married. I mean, that's the other pasuk. Anyway, you'll see, I hope, you'll see to show you I'll give you the different interpretation and so on, and then, but I want to talk tonight about how it relates to the Rav understanding of sexuality. Just b'mikra, on Channel 8, there's a program, I think every Tuesday, on sex, sexuality and so on, research and then all the rest of the stuff. It was very interesting that just this week, when they happened to see that part of the program at the end, I got to fit my stuff into Linda's thing. You know? I'm not free. But in any event, I happened to catch the program, part of it, and they said something very interesting, that the research in sex has shifted away from individual sexuality, technique, and orgasm, and all the rest of the aspects of sexuality, which for the last 50 years was the dominant focus, whether it's how-to or this or whatever, but the basic focus was the sex act and all the periphery. That was the research. And it's interesting, at the end of the program they said that the research now has shifted. It have to do with most. Halt cup, forget about your personality, forget about everything, and start to talk, do something related to the text. Or you're studying Piaget or whatever. But in these areas, when you start to get into the psychological domain, well, experientials play a big role. I am not at all talking about that. I'm not judging anything. I don't claim to know anything about that, and I didn't know the Rav personally, and I don't know anything about that, and it's really a degradation to draw from what somebody writes an experiential picture. It's just too loose to do something like that. You want to have imagination, you want to write a novel, fine, but you can't, you're talking about a range of experientials in a person. A writing, any amount of writing will not be sufficient to generate that. Because there are so many aspects and so many fine dimensions in the picture that you're just going to miss. You think you're going to say something, but you're not really going to say something. Okay, so the first point is that I started off with this idea of rational animal to indicate it's still in the literature, it's still in the philosophical literature, but it's not in the scientific literature. Why not? Why doesn't if you look at the language, why don't they talk about rational animal in the scientific? First, because the methodology is not classification. You're not classifying. We're not dealing with zoology. And even there, the way we classify and how we classify, we're classifying functions. We're classifying functions and structures that are operative in the being. In the being. Never mind whether it's animal species with rationality or rationality with animality. We're talking about the person, the human being. And now, in the human being, there are functions and structures, okay, that look like an animal. But the assumption is, and the findings show, that a human being is a human being, and a monkey is a monkey, and the twain shall never meet. And Prigogine won the prize for chemistry in one of his books called Chance and Necessity, says that until we understand the human life system, we do not understand the animal life system. It's full, chock full of anthropomorphisms. From communication, and animal talk, and birds, and all the rest of the stuff. And things that look the same. Things that look the same. It could be 98% the same, but the 2% makes a difference. So that the scientific approach is not concerned with classification per se. It's concerned with, here's the human being, the human being. Inside that human being, there are different types of functions and structures, some of which can be labeled sexuality. But they can't be labeled sexuality of a bear. In other words, the scientific approach gets more into the concrete than the philosophical. So in the philosophical approach, we can, for philosophic purpose, we can say, oh yes, man is a rational animal, and explain what the rationality is, and so on and so on and so on, without dealing with functions. But in the scientific approach, the basic orientation is not classification, it's how to get knowledge with predictability and laws and so on and so on and so on, to get knowledge of how this thing is working. But the basic existence is the human being. And anything in the human being, put another way, there's nothing in the human being that's duplicated in the animal. Because what you do is, for those people who think there is, you play with abstraction. You cut off by abstraction. You eliminate certain concrete dimensions, and then you say, well, they're the same. Because perceptually, right, they look the same. They look the same if you live on a farm and so on. You see animal behavior, and it looks the same. But it's, in concept, not the same. And upon analysis, you'll see that everything and anything in the human being is human, and anything and everything in the animal world is animal. And you'll see that if you see how it operates, for those who persist in holding the big distinction, it all depends on where you cut the abstraction. If your arrow is into the up, into the general, into the universal, into the big universal picture, then it goes with a level of abstraction that cuts out a lot of the stuff at the concrete level. In science, the more concrete, the better. If you have a theory and it doesn't relate to the concrete, well, we're missing the applications. We're missing the understanding package. So in science, the arrow is into the concrete, into the things that are happening and how they're happening, what laws are they following and so forth. And in the philosophical, the vector is up into the general. As you could see, my favorite example, in metaphysics, you are concerned with the general of the general. Namely, the classification of being, of isness, okay? Everything has isness. So you're concerned with the classification, so much so that non-being was a form of being. Now, as you made the class so empty of concreta, of bottom, that here you have something that's non-being. And it is a prat, shall we say, in the material. Now, that's not science. Science gets universals, of course, but it wants universals with constraints that have to do with functions and structures in the person. And so, what we see in the first point is that when a person looks at the Torah system, especially at the mitzvot, from the point of view of livability of practice, Chaim May's point is very well taken, that we are dealing with, inside the material of the halakha, of the different mitzvot, we are dealing with concreta, with empirical concreta, and in those formulation of those different mitzvot, one can very well label them life, health, technology. That based on laws of development, whatever it is. I don't care where the laws come from for the moment. You could argue, but the point is there are laws. Freud has got laws, Piaget got laws. They got into difficulty. Piaget, used a conversational technique, with 3 or 4 people. Well, science said, no, you can't, you have to have numbers and statistics. And so Piaget worked with 3 little children and writes his book, a whole book on the nature of space or whatever the topic. Well, Piaget took the flak. He said, what do you mean? Where's the scientific method? Okay, that's another argument for another time. And the same thing with Freud. They said, what kind of a theory is that? What kind of a business is that with psychoanalytic and so on and so on? Of ego, id, superego, what is this all about? Okay, we don't have to get into that. But the basic point is this first point of the Rav being a philosophical person. Now, shall we say the following? Just to interrupt for a hot pastrami sandwich. 60 years ago in New York, you couldn't get a hot pastrami sandwich. There were no kosher restaurants in New York. There was one or two places, and if you had a date and you wanted to eat supper, there were one or two places without names that were kosher, and that's it. That's what you had. And with ice cream, there was a ice cream parlor that was kosher and stayed open Motzei Shabbat, because after a date, you went for ice cream, you didn't want to eat, you went for ice cream, and of course you met Chaim Berlin and all the yeshiva boys, because that was the only place to get the kosher. There was Howard Johnson and this, but this was the only place to get kosher ice cream. So that was the situation. Okay, so if we're talking to somebody at that time and saying, look, it'd be nice to go for a hot pastrami sandwich. So somebody happened over to hear that, and he says, there's nothing in Manhattan. But there is something in the Bronx. Jerome Avenue. Jerome Avenue is 5.5 miles long. It's one of the longest streets in Manhattan, in New York City, but also in the Bronx, I think it's the longest street. 5.5 miles long. And the train IRT, has a Jerome Avenue line, and it runs elevated, and it runs up there all the way up to the top. Passes Yankee Stadium and all the rest of the things. So, the point was, the guy says, Manhattan, you won't find a kosher place. But Jerome Avenue, yeah, I understand. You guys never studied with him. But for those who studied with the Rav, at that time, whether you agree or you disagree, the Rav was a charismatic person that exuded Torah all the time, and in beautiful ways, and with language that for the most part was exquisite and uplifting, and had a reputation. People packed into the shiur for a yortzeit shiur, when he would give a yortzeit shiur for his father, Ramosha. People would come in from all over, and even when I was in Boston, we used to go to the shiur in Boston. Motzei Shabbat had a shiur. They packed in. If you didn't come on time, forget it. Go home. You won't get in. The Rav had this whole charisma. I said many times at the time, because I was more prepared for the philosophical aspects of the Rav than my friends and others who are from the yeshiva, from the kollel, and the Masifta and so on, or YU people studying in the Rav's halacha shiur. But this was the philosophy shiur, so I was more prepared than others, and I used to give a preparatory class of about a half hour before the Rav started. So if he started at 10 o'clock usually, 9:30, something like that, I would give a review kind of a thing. And after the shiur, everybody went to lunch. We brought, you brought your lunch and everything. And while the guys were eating, preparing to come 2 o'clock for the halacha shiur, I would go over the philosophical points that were made in the Rav. So of course I learned a lot by having to do that. And everybody appreciated it, and it was a joint kind of an interchange, and I learned a lot from the story. Okay, so the Rav had this thing. But at the time, from listening to the lectures, I also felt that he's going in a different direction. He's not going the way I'm going. Because already in 55, 56, even having not met the great giant for my Rebbe, I didn't meet him. I didn't know who he was. And somehow I was already a little disturbed about philosophy. I was already spreading a few inadequate wings concerning the scientific. And my vector was moving and learning something about science. I didn't know anything about science. My first courses that I taught were existentialism, Sartre, Buber, and then later Nietzsche, when I learned and understood more, and Rousseau, and these were my courses: philosophy of language, philosophy of science, and these courses. And I started off, you look at my Sartre book, it was all marked up because that was what I started with. I was in the existentialist orientation. Okay, but I was somehow moving out. And I said, you know, being 2 years with the Rav put me behind the 8 ball. I really felt that he put me behind, not ahead. Notwithstanding all the beauty that was involved in the presentations. It's not in any way to belittle the charismatic dimension of the Rav. Anybody who's with him knows that. Okay. But conceptually, intellectually, I was sort of in the middle, on the way out, and saying, something's wrong with this, something's wrong with this. One of the things that got me was that at that time the Rav talked about Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai and used sociological political categories to define them. And it didn't ring well for me. That Hillel was more democratic and Shammai was more aristocratic. Now, having come from University of Chicago and having studied political philosophy with some of the great people of the time, you know, these words took on a different meaning than the average person who didn't study the material. But having studied the political philosophy with Leo Strauss in particular, who was the king of the political, for Jews, for those people who weren't satisfied with a sociological or political orientation to politics. Harold Lasswell was the big man in the political, but the approach was political science. What are the generalizations and the laws that are operative in lobbying, in election, in this and that, and so on and so on, the different topics. If you read Lasswell, was a great book. Great, I think you can call it Power in Politics, something like that. But anyway, you read the book, you saw the greatness, and you said, oh my God, if that's politic, where does Judaism fit in? Where does Torah come into the picture? Torah is philosophical. It's not concerned just with things that are operative at the concrete level here of what we call science. So Strauss was a haven for that group of people, Jewish people who were even not religious, but were oriented toward a philosophical approach to politics, concerned with the good, with the beautiful, the true, with the whole conception of the political, from the point of view not of how it works, not from the point of view of government, but from the point of view of jurisprudence, of the values. And the whole value orientation was not to be found in the great universities. And so when Strauss came over much earlier from Europe, say from the Nazi business and so on, so when Strauss came over, he was at the New School and so on, then he wound up at the University of Chicago, and he taught political philosophy. And that was great. He knew his onions, he wrote in a number of books and so on, so much so that I personally used Strauss's books in my courses on the political more than anybody else, more than de Tocqueville, more than Montesquieu, more than the Federalist Papers, other readings that I included in my reading list. Strauss was, and for preparation, I put more time into Strauss than into anybody else. So from the personal point of view, he meant a tremendous amount for me at that time. Since then, of course, you know, we're talking now going back 50, 60 years. Going back 50, 60 years for any person, and for me as well, what does one know when they get a doctorate? Nothing. Like they came to my office in Boston and they said, oh, we got the Harvard list. I said, what? We got the Harvard list. You just graduated, right? Yeah. You're on a textbook? I said, I'm also a football player. See the door? I'm going to kick you out of the door if you don't go out by yourself. I said, I just graduated. I don't know anything. So why are you coming to me to write a textbook? Well, that's what we do. You see, we get to go to Yale and California and Chicago and we get the graduates and we say, look, you don't have to do it now, but sign up a kind of a contract. 2 years from now, you'll be more seasoned and you can start writing textbooks. And that's the way it worked. That's the way they got the people. And from one point of view, that's a great thing to do. I mean, it puts you on the map. You write a good textbook, puts you on the map. Okay. So, to come back to the point about the Rav. So, the Rav in this book, which puts together these essays, he quotes the pasuk 3 or 4 times. I think 3 or 4 times. 4, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Now, in the English, which came first, he leaves out the end of the pasuk. He says, the person shall leave his mother and father, right? And Gavak be'ishto, le'ishto, whatever thing. You can't bypass these b, l, k. That's another story. Be careful when you read the Chumash. I found that you have to not go with the colloquialism, but if it says b, it says ma, it says la, it meant that, and don't feed in something that's not there. Some of the letters in the prefixes have 2 or 3 different meanings, but don't take, if it says k and it says mem, well, don't just switch them. I mean, it meant mem. It meant with a ko or with kof or with a hey or whatever the thing happens to be. I found it to be very important in reading the text to make sure you don't swallow up the whole thing. Okay, come back to the basic point. What's the point? So the Rav, in the English, says you should leave your mother and father, davak leishto, and you basar echad. So in the book, he left out basar echad. In the other 3 places, he put in basar echad. He quoted the full pasuk. In this book, in this one essay, he left out basar echad. And there are no 3 dots. Usually if you leave out something in a pasuk, or in any kind of a way, the convention is you put 3 dots to indicate that. Okay? In the English, which came first, there are no 3 dots. In the Hebrew, when you look at the Hebrew translation, in the other 3 places, it's the full pasuk. But in this one place, page 165 on this, you can look at it if you want, just to see it in your own eyes. I mean, I'm not giving you a story. Page 165 there, he leaves out the last 2 words and does not put in 3 dots. In the Hebrew translation, yes, they left out the 2 words, but they did put in 3 dots. Now, experiential world of ideas, Judaism, like Christianity, negates the body. And it's still permeating today. You look at some of the research and some of the people and the Baal Tshuvas and so on, you'll see that this is, sometimes people come in because of spirituality or whatever, but leave because they can't make compatible their whole approach to the sexual. And I'm not talking now about aberrations. I'm not getting into anything of male and lesbianism and all. It's all, for the moment, it deserves its own sessions about how we can talk about it some other time, how the Torah looks at all these things. That's something else. I'm talking about the classical relation that's carried by that language. And so the next question is, it's very difficult to say that this is a metaphor. I ask you, why would the Torah put in the metaphor? Say it straight. Look for a different language, so it had 3 words instead of 2. Look for a different language, so that the reader won't interpret it as a metaphor. Why have to have a metaphor? Be straight. When it says that I am making the human being, lo tov, yeh levad. Okay, I'm going to make ezer kenegdo. That's the other pasuk in the text that relates to the sexuality as included in a much broader category of ezer kenegdo. A woman working the fields, picking up, something. helping the person, and so on and so on and so on. In the Rav, this will develop into love of Torah, the meeting of both the male and the female in a spiritual, higher level plane, which all of that is built into Ezer Kenegdo. And so what's the metaphor? And what's the locus of the metaphor? You didn't have to say Basar Echad, because that already is included in the second pasuk there about it's not good that man be alone. I'm bringing the different people, the animals, and whatever the human being says is the name of the animal. That's itself deserving of a whole big issue, because that's the performative, which we'll talk about some other time in its own context. But the basic point is, that's how to understand that is that's the Torah's conception of language. That naming is the performative. Okay, that's another thing, how we work through that problem. But the basic point over here is that intimacy of all kinds, of a meeting of the minds, of being from the same family background, and blah, 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 all these kind of things are included in Ezer Kenegdo. So that the whole sexual dimension is included. So why do you need the metaphor? If you didn't have the metaphor in the pasuk, okay? So you would automatically connect that pasuk. A man leaves his mother and father and gets married. And indeed, it's a fulfilling out of what it says, that it's no good for a man to be alone. And he has to have in that relation levels of intimacy, including the body. I mean, what's the problem? So that there's a conceptual problem here about, just from the language point of view, why metaphor? And where's the locus of the metaphor? When you could have done without it and not have raised the whole problem that has plagued people for so many centuries. Now, okay. So, the basic point I try to make now was that the Rav is a philosophical thinker. And in that context, he said a lot of things about the sexual domain, about intimacy and so forth. He said a lot of things that are absolutely correct, but not quite sufficient for a scientific understanding of the topic. So, for example, in working out, in trying to work out for the last couple of months about what is the difference between Ezer Kenegdo and Basar Echad, which I touched upon in one of the talks before, I went to the narcissism literature. And I said, well, that may be a nice place to start. Maybe if I examine the narcissism literature, I'll get some clues as to a different translation of Basar Echad, and give a certain credence to Jerome by giving a different emphasis in the translation. Delavay translated its shape, but I didn't have anything to go with that. I didn't know what to do with it. So I said, let it lay for a while. Maybe it'll come back. But let's go on the intimacy dimension, and what's that all about? So I said, I'm going to go to the narcissism literature, okay, and I'm going to see what I could pick up that will help me get a new translation of Basar Echad. It turns out that Freud himself wrote a paper in 1914 on narcissism. It was very early. It was followed by Havelock Ellis and a number of other people that worked in the psychoanalytic field who were concerned with sexuality and so forth. And so there was a whole tradition of a number of writers, but of course Freud was the great giant in this, and I mention him specifically. As a matter of fact, the essay is online, and you could read it yourself online, so you can see his language and the way he handles it and so on. But the basic point that comes through is 3 points. One, that when you read the Rav, when he deals with the halacha material on man-woman, husband-wife relationships, you see that what's called negative narcissism, unhealthy narcissism, because there's what's called healthy narcissism and unhealthy narcissism. If you look on Google, you can plug in both and you have different readings under each one. There's what's called a healthy narcissism and an unhealthy narcissism. Okay, so for the moment leave, that will come back here right away. But the basic point is that when you look at the list of characteristics, personality characteristics, that are lined up with unhealthy narcissism, you see that when the Rav deals with the relationships at the concrete level, 95% of what's written in the narcissism literature he already puts into the understanding of the halachot. So, for example, the person tends to lie. A big factor in the narcissism relation. The person has a kind of a obliviousness to the practical and could hurt somebody because they're living in their own world. And they list in the narcissism literature, I'm not going to take the trouble to do it, you can do it for yourself, but they list in the narcissism literature all of the unhealthy narcissisms. Okay? And lo and behold, I'm looking for something, I didn't find any of them that fit into Basar Echad. So it was a dead end. I tried it, a dead end. I learned something about the narcissism, but it was a dead end. Didn't do anything. Okay. But I found out, I saw that Freud calls it some kind, it's like an enigmatic paradox or something. Namely, healthy narcissism is not sick narcissism. It's defined from the negative. I didn't find anything positive. What is positive in the thing? So we say unconditional love. We use phrases like that, but they don't fit the Basar Echad thing, which is what I was looking for. Okay? So we say unconditional love. What does that mean, unconditional love? That you'll die for the person, that you'll be there all the time. What does that mean? In Heidegger, you should know a fundamental distinction is care and concern. And care, I tried that for a while. To say, oh, care, what Heidegger means by caring, which includes bonding and the Devek, that's when he writes, caring is Basar Echad. And concern is Ezer Kenegdo. So there's different relationships. In life, when you're like, the Rebbe used to say, if a friend of yours asks you for something, so you give it without a second thought. If somebody that you haven't seen for 20 years asks you something, so you take a few minutes to think about it. If somebody that you met once as an acquaintance in a cafeteria and asks you for $500, well, you give $10, $20. You don't give $500. If that's a lot of money, it's reserved for people who are close to you. And when your friend asks, you just, bingo. We just got one of those things in the mail about, we're stranded in England. That letter business. Linda called up the gal, it's one of her friends, because maybe it was true. Of course, we had that before, so we know not to expect anything. But the basic point was this whole thing. Okay, so I looked in the narcissism literature, and when Freud came up in 1914 and said, every person develops a healthy narcissism. Healthy narcissism is a sense of grounding yourself, a sense of self-love, a sense of self-respect. All of these are included in healthy narcissism. But when you examine and you try to came to them for a shilas, not halachic so much as life advice. And she must have been quite a woman. I didn't know her at all. I mean, I never met her. I just knew the face, but I never met her. But the Rav, I didn't meet him in person, but I davened in the shul many times. And in YU, I was in the class for 2 years. Okay, but anyway, this is the point. So, when the Rav moves and starts to widen up the thing, see, It's called family redeemed. The name of the book doesn't say sexuality redeemed. There is an essay called Redemption of Sexuality. Now, again, see, what's the music? What do you mean redeemed? You have to redeem sexuality? Redeem, redemption, that's a religion term. That's like a geula term. Because you have to upgrade. Well, when you upgrade, usually you downgrade something else. In other words, there's an aspect of way of reading what he says which carries over from my earlier remarks about his philosophical mentality. He's not a scientist, he's a philosopher. And so, even this way, the language he uses and the way he uses can be read, jumps out at you. What do you mean redeemed? Where'd you get the word? What do you mean? And it's not just, it's probably his word because it was part of the thing. But what's the point? What's the point? It turns out, I mean, it's wild. He says in the last analysis, he uses Buber. Incidentally, she uses Buber. He was very big, apparently. I read Iron Thou a number of times. I wrote on Buber. I read Buber, a lot of his books. I have at least up for sale, I don't know, 20 of his books. I read a lot of his stuff. And at that time, he was very, very popular also in Judaism, but also in the Protestant theological seminaries. I mentioned once that I studied at Union, across the street from Columbia, 2 years, on what they call Old Testament, to see how they read and how they understand the Old Testament. And I would sit there with a kippah, and of course people came over to me. They thought I knew something, Hebrew, you know. They see a guy sitting there with a kippah in the class, and there's 100 kids in one of these sloped auditoriums at Union Theological, which is the Protestant seminary in New York, you know, and a high-level place. And they thought I understood it. You know, I said, well, get the dictionary, get Jastrow. Well, I didn't know anything, you know. Yeah, of course, you can learn a lot in 50 years. But the point is, I was there, I was part of it, and I saw. And what disturbed me no end, I remember my experience today. When the Rav came out in 1966 with The Lonely Man of Faith, it was put on the reading list for every Protestant seminary in the country. So I said, why did the Rav have to write in English? He should have wrote it in Hebrew so it wouldn't be put on a Protestant list. See, I had a chush all the time, and it's still with me. If somebody sees the same thing in Judaism as he finds in Christianity, there's something wrong with his Judaism. When the Pope said, Levinas is my favorite philosopher, and Levinas wrote, he was a religious person, and he wrote on Judaism, and the Pope says Levinas is his favorite philosopher, that means he missed something essential in Judaism. That's the way I look at it. There's no need for that kind of talk. It's like the ongoing battle between France and England in the nature of philosophy of science. Every Frenchman, Duhem and Poincaré and the Frenchmen, somewhere in the book, take it off the shelf and you'll see a smack at Thompson, a smack at an Englishman, okay? And vice versa. You'll see, it's just a refrain on Paganini. I mean, every couple of pages you'll see this battle of primacy in physics given to the French or given to the English. I found that in Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky in the latter part of the century, of the 19th century, early 20th century. As a matter of fact, her books is some of the books I bought new. I very seldom bought books new, everything was used. But her books, you know, she was dealing with healing. This is the time of the Ouija board and all that kind of stuff, in the latter part of the century, of the 19th century, early 20th century. And she wrote something called The Secret Doctrine, and Isis Unveiled, two thick, down here somewhere, two thick, big thick, 900-page volumes. I read them many times over the years, and I learned a lot in some of it. But what I wanted to say was, every 20 pages or so, there's a remark about Judaism. either about the Kabbalah, most of them were negative. In other words, it was a refrain in her. She's a non-Jew. She was doing Christianity. She had a Christian dimension to some of the thing. And in her case, every once in a while there was something thrown in that didn't fit the syntax. It was like extra. It's like a footnote. Oh, the Jews. And so, again, the same thing, and that put me on guard. Whenever I find that, it put me on guard to say, well, maybe I don't understand something that I'm missing because I wouldn't say that. And lo and behold, when I examined Levinas and wrote a book on Levinas, Levinas is an outsider. Levinas is from the humanist dimension of Torah. Levinas is not in the Bris Shita, okay, that's one problem. And Levinas is in the phenomenology context. He translated Heidegger, no, it's a different ballgame. But the point is, it was on guard, for me to watch those things when the things come up. Okay. So what I want to say, at the end of the Rav picture, he has, for example, that in Buber terms, meaningfulness comes from an I-thou relation, from a relation to people, person to person. In no way treating the other person as an it, as a thing. Oh, you treat me like a piece of meat. Oh, you treat me like an object. Go down through the literature from the normal colloquial statements and you'll see exemplary exactly what's being talked about. The unhealthy and healthy narcissism. Unhealthy narcissism will have a locution, a whole range of statements that are being made on the spot with the two people on the TV and so on. That's the jargon that reflects this whole business. So from the negative, I said the Rav was powerful. From the positive, the Rav in effect said, we have to look not only at people in an I-thou relation, we have to look at Torah itself as an I-thou relation. And when we fall in love with Torah, when we really have an unconditional love of Torah, okay, we have the best possibility of avoiding negative, unhealthy narcissism. And so the Rav's philosophical concern, right, the philosophical concern went right through the book, such that in the last piece of the book, he talks about the Shekhinah, and he talks about the Torah orientation from the point of view of an I-thou relation. And a best way, in a big sense, of avoiding or minimizing or excluding completely unhealthy narcissism. So that he's saying there's two loves. It's like care and concern. There's studying the text, and he says it in the educational context, studying the text from the point of view of trying to understand what's being said in the Shapravataya of a Sugya, okay? Where what's dominant is intellect. The Rav says, remember, the Rav's coming from Brisk. The Rav says, that's not the ideal. The ideal is the process, to use process of product language. The ideal is falling in love with Torah. When you fall in love, meaningfulness exudes all over your face. It exudes in everything you do. Simcha, it just comes out automatically. Like Moshe Rabbeinu coming down with the second Luchot and the beams are streaming from his face. In other words, the Rav himself, coming from Brisk with a high level emphasis on intellect, remember, on analysis, on careful linguistic, halachic analysis in terms of the word, in terms of the concept. Shnei dinim. What do you mean Shnei dinim? The motto of Brisk is the Shnei dinim. That, to come to a conclusion that something is Shnei dinim is a fantastic thing. To say that one thing has two functions, Well, in science, that's fundamental. It has two different functions. Well, that's important to differentiate the functions. So it looks like there's only one function. And the Rav discovers by halachic analysis in Brisk Shita that there are two functions. And one is a din in Basar Chalov, and one is a din in Tefillah. Wow, that's a big contribution. Whereas before the distinction, we put it in one category. It's a din in Basar Chalov. That's it. And in personal identity, assuming that you can only have one love, I'm still, at this age, I'm still not sure who I am. Am I on the assumption you can only have one ultimate love? Is your ultimate love Torah, okay, on all different planes, or is your ultimate love philosophy in this narrow sense of paving the way for Levinson physics? And I say both you'll see in my life, but I'm at times, indicating from behaviors, at times it seems one takes over. And you want to be remembered not as a Torah person first, but as a contributor to the new understanding of life in the science, which is where we are. So if somebody reads the book or somebody reads the thing and they say, oh, this helped me formulate this aspect of a Levinson physics, wow, what a compliment, what a fantastic thing. Of course, the other half says, well, the hell with that. That's so important. Sure, you're going to help people and there's going to be a development in medicine and this and that and so on and so on. But what gave you the opening? Torah gave the opening because it had so many things that I didn't understand. I probed it for 40 years. So my whole life was because Torah was Torah. And it gave me my whole intellectual and personal life. So that's not important. So I'm still in the struggle to it, as I showed the last time. Once I talked about the history, the book on the proclamation. As soon as I saw that the notion of historic right is dissolved or has certain presuppositions about the nature of time, I stopped writing on the proclamation and finished the book in terms of the nature of time. Of course, it was under the influence of Heidegger and everything, but it showed you from the work. I stopped immediately. Since then, I finished it, but I stopped immediately, and I was preoccupied with the nature of time, the nature of history. So you saw from the activity, I didn't continue. I should have continued. Do it next time. What are you so burning up? Because right on the spot, I said, if I have a reputation of historic right in concept, that's a contribution to everybody in philosophy. Historians will read it and they will see I have a big point here. It fits part of Yerushalmi, who's world-renowned. So I'm now entering, with no reputation in anything, I'm entering into a domain where if a person reads it, he sees that what I'm writing is germane to a study of Freud, to a study of Yerushalmi on the nature of history, and to the study of Heidegger and so on. So, well, one should take that as a feather. But I'm only saying I'm stuck in the middle. Don't know where exactly. But, okay, but the basic point is that Levinson physics that takes body as a given will upon analysis be shown to be absolutely inadequate for a life system. In other words, organism is not good enough. Anything that presupposes body is not going to be adequate to the life system. You will be stuck at the end. I make a prediction, and everybody I read is stuck. You will be stuck with psychophysical parallelism. You read Brennan, and sure enough, all the stuff that I said before is true, but when you look at the paragraphs one by one, it's a version of psychophysical parallelism. Namely, we have auras, okay, which can be seen. forget about, don't be Freddie, be skeptical. Whatever it is, they can be photographed. And they're seen. Okay, and people have the knack of training themselves to see them. Mayer says he was 6, 7 years old, he saw. So that, I don't deny all of that. I give the benefit of the doubt. Okay, but what's going on? In the mapping of points on the body, there are psychological points. Well, psychological is mental, and aura is, quote, physical. Namely, you see it in perception. You see the coloration, you see the density, how far it is from the body, from the skin, and so on, so on, so on, so on. So it turns out, Brennan, the great healer, okay, is doing now, as far as she got, from my point of view, about liphonic physics, the book isn't going anywhere. Except that she says in one place, b'mikra, or shall we say not b'mikra, she's writing a handbook, a how-to book, not a theoretical exercise. If she were writing theoretical, it could be she will agree with what I said. But she's writing practical, and to put more things in will mess up the reader, who's learning from her how to do it, how to do the hands-on healing, not the theoretical structure, not a liphonic physics. But one of the things I saw was, what are we talking about here? What do you mean a line and a solid? If you took a thin piece of paper and you folded it up, one on top of the other, and you pushed it together, you compressed it together, it's going to look like a body, like a cube. But no, it's not a cube. It's very thin pieces of paper, like an onion skin, compressed to each other, which functions like a body. Yes, it functions like a body. If you put it on a pool table or whatever, you'd have to have certain motions to make it move. As being this, you have to duplicate the way we push a thing, a regular ball on a thing. You have to use it functions as a body. But in essence, or in concept, it's not a body. It's a line shape. It's many line shapes compressed. You wouldn't believe it. In one of the places here in her book, she says, in talking about the lowest aura, she has 7 levels of aura. She says, I should get you the paragraph, she says, it's like an infinite number of planes coming in from all directions pushed together. Now look, I'm not crazy. I said that the week before in another paragraph. That's what I said. Don't ask too much what it means yet. How the plane can move. I said it's not a flying saucer. It's not, but for the moment, that's where we are. We're trying to now build on the plane and not the solid. And in chaos theory, that's one of the things that's big. And mapping the brain, and their basic examples are the brain and the heart. And they're showing that they exhibit chaotic behavior, and to me, part of the chaotic behavior comes from the fact that things are folded, are compressed, thins are compressed and look like bodily, but they really are not bodily. They're 2-dimensional, not 3-dimensional. And so inside of the chaos theory, inside of the chaos people, is an attempt to link up, how I don't know enough, to link up chaotic phenomena with this shift from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional, and folding and folding. And that I found it in her was a little crazy. She's dealing with auras. Why did she bring in some kind of emotion like that? When I showed it to Mayer, I said, read those 2 pages. So he wrote back, he said, you ain't seen nothing yet. Of course, because Mayer is coming with the Kabbalah. Mayer is coming with infinitely more than I got. He sees all of this stuff. It's straight Mefurash in the Ramchal, if you understand it. The Ramchal was concerned with this. The Ramchal was concerned. He didn't like the idea of 7,000th and 8,000th year. He was concerned with the nature of time. He was concerned with there is no past, there is no future, it's only the now. He was concerned with the big contemporary issues in the formulation of a life system. So Meir is coming in not only with the practical experience, but with the, as a healer, but with the Kabbalah underpinning. And so when he says something, you know, I listen with 5 ears because he's talking, he's coming in with much more than she. And even she, there's a religion dimension which I throw away. There's Christ in the book. If you look on her name on Google, she's linked up with healing, spiritual healing. She said at first it was aura healing. And then as she went and worked with people, she tells you. I graduated out of that, and for the last number of years, she's 79, for the last number of years, I've been doing spiritual healing. In other words, when the Rav is saying Shechina and I thou, and she says the same thing, uses the same metaphor of Buber, I thou relation. In spiritual healing, we're dealing with the higher dimensions. And we have to see people and see others as thou relation. In religion, in relation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's an I thou relation, not I it. You're not it, and Hashem is not it. If you do that, you mavatal the whole understanding healing plane to carry the point that you can't just throw me out and say, look, you're dope, it's all nonsense. It's not all nonsense. She's got enough material to say it can't be bypassed. You have to say something about it. You have to relate eventually to telekinesis and so on. So I'm saying maybe the way to relate is to take away the basic assumption. All of these fields in cognitive psychology and everything have not made this move. They didn't make the move. Even in topology, the Rebbe thought that it would be topology. But topology apparently, even though I don't know enough, has not removed. Topology is a form of geometry. And it's dealing with space, and for it, flat space is a projection or presupposes a regular, three-dimensional space. So that they didn't get rid of it. They just shifted the focus. And so we can talk about colored shapes and how they fit together and so on and so on, but it's not rich enough. Topology is not going to be the mathematization, it's going to be something else. Because topology presupposes body and organism. And so we're still in Greek. Organism was the Greek word. And what did they do? They got it from the nature of movement. Growth, right? The plant grows, expands, but does not locomote, does not move itself, right? And then the animal world moves itself either through the air, through the water, and so on, or on the land, okay? And the human being, you should know that as a matter of information, but you should know that Dhyānama, the nature of the soul, which was what Aristotle called his book on thinking and mentality, Dhyānama is the name of the book, the soul, and for Aristotle it was a physical science. In other words, it was conceived as a type of motion. There was growth, locomotion, and ideation as a movement of ideas. And so Dhyānama is not a cultural thing. In Aristotle, Dhyānama is a physical science, and it's organized in the corpus after the physics. After the physics is the metaphysics, before the physics is the Dhyānama. And that was a very important point that you should know just as a matter of information, that for Aristotle, Dhyānama was an adjunct to physics because it dealt with motion. Thought was a motion, a type of motion. So when you're dealing with motion,
Ruach also.
yeah, right. That's what I meant, because that's part of the, in the Kabbalah, for example, when they give you the 5, it's the same thing in Aristotle. there are 5 levels of intellection. 5, built on 5. Aristotle Deanum is built on 5. And I asked whether who got it from whom and everything, I don't know. We came first, I left it open for inquiry. But the point is that when you look at the material, you see that it's in this framework. Ruach, Nefesh, Neshama, and so on. Now I think the Kabbalah is much richer and doesn't stick and stay exclusively in the Greek perspective. But that's another big topic of the way you know. But the basic point is that I finally said something that does more than just say there's a life like physics. It says that we maybe have a handle. Maybe we have to start to look at this. And lo and behold, when I looked on the Google, your friend Prigogine talks about the one dimension, two-dimensional space, and enfolding and unfolding. It's right in there in Prigogine.
Prigogine.
He dealt with surfaces, but basically...
He's not speak about time?
I didn't find it, but I'm sure it's there. You know, I just didn't reread it recently, but I read it a long time ago.
He's
I used
talking
it.
about cows. Yeah. It's time not relevant for.
But he probably does. But you know, it was a great book at the time I read it. It's already a long time ago. You know, at least 50 years. I mean, I have to deal with big numbers. You know, I have to deal with big numbers. You know what I mean? But when you come across certain things like that, they perk up, like this thing with her. She said it, I didn't say it, she said it. It's analogous to an infinite number of planes coming and lining up with each other and being compressed. Well, I just said it. That's exactly what the mistake was. Okay, because it functions as a body. So we're mixing up the function with the essence of the thing. It's not a body, but it looks like a body, right? When you fold it up, it looks like a body. If you want to make, like in making paper things for children, it does look real sometimes. You make a napkin display, Hannah puts a napkin on the table, it looks real. It's fantastic. You really think you have to look at all sides to see where the thing is. That's beautiful. I mean, no. But these are in our language, 3-dimensional presuppositions. Anyway, I talked too much, but this was the basic thing. It's so exciting. I mean, and it comes from a pursuance of this. Now, why are we so sure that the Chumash is concerned with sexuality in the narrow sense of intimacy? Compared to what we're just talking about, we're talking about the world, we're talking about the cosmos, we're talking about the big world, we're talking about contemporary physics. We're not limiting it to shape and so on. But I made a suggestion 3 weeks ago that in addition to the brain and the heart, which are the 2 main organs that they are dealing with in chaos theory, and I didn't take the cholya to read anything, just shooting from the hip, that the heart and the brain are the 2 organisms that they're working with in terms of exemplification of chaotic phenomena, okay? As crazy as it sounds, I said there's a third. The third organ, if you want to call it, is the man-woman interrelation.